Welcome to Resilient Foundations. We're back with Doug Hall talking about some more great project moments. Getting a lot of lessons learned out of all these great experiences, big transformational, high risk, high stakes initiatives that we've had to deliver over the years. This one we're going to talk about today is a project that was around the open banking regulation. So again, it's another compliance type of project, but had a lot of also customer impact in why this was really important. And it was a financial services industry and a regulatory type of push. The specific project we're going to talk about today was a financial services company that had to meet compliance in the EU, which is always very difficult, Australia and Brazil, and regulations that had come into force. And the risks around this were preventing the bank license that the company held from being suspended or revoked. And a lot of companies actually had to deal with this that were in the financial services space doing international. And even in the US, there were standards appearing around this space that were causing these types of issues. And then also preventing substantial daily fees and penalties if you did not meet the regulatory requirements. And lastly, avoiding brand damage because public notices could be sent out if you were not compliant with these. And part of just being suspended or revoked in your license would prevent you from operating actually in that market. Now, for consumers, you might say, well, why do I care about open banking? But if you think back to the days of when you'd had companies where you would go in and you would enter every single one of your financial accounts to go get an aggregated view, for example, of all of your position across all of your accounts in one single screen, that whole concept of data aggregation and you putting in all of your credentials, your username, password, and then these companies would go out and scrape data. That was an initiating genesis of some of the reason why the regulators and also some of the industry groups wanted to get to a more secure and transparent use of customer data, as well as pricing around different ways that companies were dealing with your information and your accounts. And really, the genesis is to put the customers back in control of how their financial data is being used. So in the EU, they passed in 2015, and it was in force, I think, around 2018 or something like that. But they put into place 2015 something called the Payment Services Directive 2, which I had a lot of interface with in other spaces of PSD2. It was a very difficult regulation to meet. And that put in place requirements for how companies could share data and what you had to do to give customers control. And then in the US, the Financial Data Exchange was formed as more of an industry or corporate body that helped with the security of and cross-company use of customer data. So there were a lot of moving parts here and a lot of different requirements across countries. And so bigger financial services companies, again, operating either in the US or across the world, really had to start stepping up to meet these types of requirements. So you as a customer would have a safer, more secure, more transparent process of having companies use your financial data. So this project had a lot of moving parts, and we're going to get into those right now with Doug. So Doug, first of all, give us your top 3 highlights of running this particular project.
Well, I wanted to just so these might get a little technical. I'll try to avoid it, but I wanted to kind of set a little tone on what the term screen scraping actually means and what happened back in the day. Banks and big financial corporations wouldn't share your data, wouldn't tell anybody what you had, wouldn't allow you to share your own data. So these other companies would start getting products that would say, we can pull your data and give you an overall budget. You, as Rebecca said, you just need to give us your login ID and passwords to each one of your financial institutions. Number one, really bad. They didn't tell you they stored your passwords and IDs. You have no idea what kind of security that they had around that. 2, it was just a bad idea because they logged on as you, and the companies at that time didn't have the mechanisms to know other companies were doing that. So it was bad security practices everywhere. Companies getting hacked, your data exposed. You had no control over what these other companies were doing with your data. So that's kind of the genesis. I just wanted to kind of set the tone of why these open banking regulations started coming into play. Financial institutions couldn't stop people from screen scraping at that time. It started to become necessary for us to get some some better secured ways to share data. And it didn't happen voluntarily. It had to go through regulatory mandates. And so that's what started in Europe. So the top three positives were, as you said, basically was spun up to force big companies to start playing in the field and letting the other smaller companies start, having some good product development and start getting new products out there that would never have been able to come to life. So that was one of the positives of this, was setting the tone and being able to participate in that. It sounded euphoric at first. Nobody thought it would work, but it started to take hold. The second really positive thing was setting up our company to be able to successfully adapt to these regulations. As you can imagine, what we were facing was each country is you look at the United States, and each state has different regulations that we have to meet. Expand that out to countries. So what we had to do was understand what the requirements were, and then start designing a system that we could reuse, without developing a new platform for every single country. It's just a great experience because we had to overcome a lot of issues and tackle a lot of things that nobody really had to do before.
So
So that was kind of a
yeah, so let's talk about some of those challenges. It sounds like understanding the actual regulatory space and the risk involved in the project for this company. Talk a little bit about how you handled that kind of a challenge. Just understanding what do we need to do to be, what's definition of done?
yeah. Well, what was really hilarious was in every company that I had talked to faced this. Right, the government would came up with a mandate, said you'll have to do this, and then it just languished in the company, just bouncing back and forth, trying to find somebody who knew what this was. Do we have to comply? Sits over in legal for a while. They put their spin on it and say yes or no, and it goes over. So these regulatory mandates, with open banking, we never done this before. It was contrary, and this is what we laughed about. I was building a platform that was contrary to everything that I had done in security. Right, protect your data. Now we're being mandated. Just start, sharing it
Sharing
out.
it.
So that was one of the biggest challenges, was getting a proper interpretation on whether we needed to do this based on the various licensing throughout these companies. That took some time, and there was a lot of interpretations of that. So that was one challenge: was, do we even have to comply? What does this regulation say we have to do? And one of the challenges were Australia, amazingly prescriptive, and getting down to the field level of the API structures, which APIs are what we use, both the person requesting data and us who had the data. We use what's called an API, to exchange that data. So we had to understand what we required to share. Certain countries had different standards. Some said, just whatever data you're sharing with the customer online on your portal, that's what you need to share. Australia went through every company must share this exact schema, this exact format, and for this exact reason. So, and then Brazil. I forgot to tell you this, Rebecca. One of the challenges, quite prevalent in Brazil, was their government was highly aggressive. They would post a mandate in Portuguese and say, you have a month to fulfill this. We had to get that translated into English, which there's some of the nuances that are in the regulation. They might be a little fuzzy when we tried to read through what does that actually mean. So
So
that was
in
a
that
massive challenge.
in that analysis of the regulations, who had the final say about what was required?
in this particular company, in this particular project,
Could
me,
be different.
because what we found is business didn't really understand the regulation. They didn't read it. They just kind of olayed well, we think it might do this. Legal got into the requirements of the law, not really understanding all the business nuances or the regulatory nuances. So there was some gray area there. Me being on the I have to deliver this, I dove in and read every single line of every single regulation 5 or 6 times. And Sherry would attest to this. We were on a bus trip on vacation for 6 hours, and I
That's how
was reading
dedicated Doug is.
PSD2.
I don't
So
know
and
how many
so
times I
we
read
had
that.
that. Yeah, I well, you know me. I get into the nuts, and I got so prescriptive in my descriptions and how I it affected us because I knew the data that they were asking for because I went through every schema, every object, every field, and to understand what they were asking for, and then knowing where that might impact our company. And then I went back to them and said, "Here's what we're going to have to share." And then we debated on does our license give us the status that the regulations had defined as you need to comply. So that was the round conversation. But in the end, it turned out that I was the only one that knew all the regulations globally, and so I became the expert. And we would have these conversations. That was another great positive thing. A lot of groups got together and we rehashed a lot of this, different perspectives, and we all came to the consensus. And it was pretty funny because we each had to say, "Well, okay, that makes sense. Good, we don't have to." And there were in Portugal, in Brazil, there were some battles. I came at odds with the business on whether we even needed to comply with
I
this.
think that's one of the things when I've done compliance projects and actually had to do some PSD2 stuff at another company. And I was talking to developers, and developers and engineers are used to being able to say, well, the business requirement is A, B, and C, and I could meet it this way or
Yeah.
this way or this way. And they kind of go in assuming they've got flexibility in the implementation. And when you're dealing with compliance requirements, oftentimes there isn't a lot of flexibility. Now, Australia, you just said, was very prescriptive. EU was less prescriptive, but said you had to meet these kinds of conditions to be in
Right.
compliance. And then Brazil was speedy, like you had to turn stuff around very quickly, but without
Yeah.
standards that every company or every country aligns to. And typically, development and engineering teams like the flexibility to just say, give me the high level requirement, I'll go figure out how to design it. And compliance requirements sometimes are, like in Australia, very prescriptive. How did you handle the no standards versus the prescriptive standards and the typical model of engineering where people want to design what they want to design?
Yeah, Australia helped because they gave you exactly what you had to share. Where the difficulty came in PSD2 was again they gave you some standards like their EGAT certificates. You had to process those. You had to gain access if they had. So they were very prescriptive on some of the security measures, which was good, communication protocols. Where they fell down when you have 32 countries in the EU, where they fell down is it's saying what exact data I had to share. What they felt was more appropriate was to say again, whatever your customer has access to, functionality and information through your portal or app, that's what you had to build to share. What that meant was we had to, kind of figure out what we actually showed to the customer and what the functionality was. But then you start looking at these aggregators that had to now say, well, this company only shares this data. This company shares this data. So they still had to design different mechanisms to acquire that data. So how we started to look, I pulled my team together. I couldn't say to my young engineers, go read all these, regulations. No, that's not their job.
And
I
honestly,
said,
I've
you
I've
need to
had senior
understand.
engineers I've handed the regulations to because I'd be like, I know you don't believe me that this is actually what the regulation says and how I've written the requirements is according to the regulations. Here's the
Now, I didn't say
regulation.
I didn't give that to them
Well,
as
I
you
know,
need
but
to
you're
read
like,
this because,
I can't make,
yeah,
and the reaction you get is, I can't make heads or tails of what this is actually saying. I said, yeah, I get that. But if you
yeah.
really want to test me on the requirements, here's the form they require, and here is right,
Europe, you couldn't do that. There was no,
right.
it was a nightmare. And that's one thing about regulatory requirements. A lot of profanity came out of the office is on because they write these regulations and they cite 50 other documents. So I have to, every single requirement was like over here, it's described. So it was a nightmare to try to get a grasp on what we actually had to deliver. Now, Australia was so prescriptive, and so was Brazil, but it was in Portuguese. Um, they were better, so I could at least start pointing my young engineers to these and say, you need to start learning these schemas. And here are the ones. But I went through every single one to say, this one we have to have, this one doesn't apply. I started them out easily. It's like, look at all these. We need to start, looking for data. You guys go dumpster diving for this data. Give me the source data. But my prod and my high level, really seasoned architect and my lead engineer and one of another developer, we sat down and it was like, okay, you know, we started to look for common themes, and what we found was each country always asked for the first three things is like customer identities, accounts, and then addresses, right? Those were the three big nuggets, or I'm sorry, transactions when I meant account activity, account and account transactions. So we could start now looking at how do we design a system that know the front end is going to be different schema wise. Where can we build a standardized backend to fetch the exact same data and reuse those internal APIs that we would develop and use already? So
Mhm.
that was the big first push is to, all right, as we sat down and said we can't develop a new an external and internal APIs for each country because we knew it was expanding. US was going to look at it, Canada was looking at it, Japan, all these countries were now starting to get their own regulations.
And I
So
think
that was,
that is the very value of really engaging architecture level people, because they think in
yeah.
terms of modularization and standardization and reusability, basically utilitizing your platforms in a way that doesn't make you do like, I have one option for Brazil and one solution for Europe and one solution for Canada and one, right. You don't want that, because that is a maintenance nightmare at the end of the day, is to try and
Oh, yeah.
maintain all of these different solutions. You really want to engage architects when you have something that's going to have a global level impact, because you will design it in a way that is that modularization, that reusability. And yes, you have to adjust for the countries, but I always took the principle of, if you design for the highest set of requirements and then do exactly what you were saying, what are the variables that I'm going to have to work around? And then you can have the architects design to the variability and standardize to the commonality.
Yeah, and we went for a configurable system, one that, what's called something, there are nuances to what Brazil calls something and what they require. Address format. So we had to say we're going to pull the same data. Name is name, but names are bigger. So we had to make sure our front end module was sophisticated enough to be able to realize what country this is coming to, how to format it, and what to call it. So we actually did a lot of good configuration and modularization up front into our response files. There's a technical word that just escaped
You're
me,
getting your
but
post,
yeah,
right?
we had to make sure our response handler. Sorry,
Yes,
we had to make sure that we had that configurable, so we didn't have to do a lot of coding
that's
as
great.
we started. And because what you were saying is exactly what happened. All of this is brand new. So the government's mandates, brand new. They needed adjustments, which meant more and more and more frequent updates to, how that works, right? New product, lots of updates, and then it starts stabilizing. It was a nightmare to try to keep ahead of all these announcements of new schema changes. I actually submitted several changes because the standards didn't meet the company that we were. And so I had a lot of battles to be fought with standards boards of these governments, which is pretty hilarious. Brazil, you just
Yeah.
didn't fight to; they didn't care.
Yeah,
They were
that's a
just
good
like, "You're doing this." Okay.
Yeah, that actually is a really good point, though, of you're not only dealing with the internal organizational understanding and getting the solution implemented, sometimes you do have to go back to the overseers, the oversight organizations, and
Yeah.
say, we can't do this, or this isn't going to work for us, or we have to do it this way because this is how we can't like redo our entire platform to meet the
Well,
regulation and try and negotiate through some of that.
yeah, well, Australia was a great example. So was Brazil, but for another reason. But Australia, because I'm very close to this. It's near and dear to my heart because it was a battle and it was tough and it was fun. It was just one of
Only
those
Doug would
projects
say
that we
it was
love,
a
right?
battle and it was
Yeah,
fun.
it was fun. Was just they developed it for banking. The schemas were called banking or whatever. They were
Right,
just
right.
banking was everywhere. We were not a bank.
Yeah,
And
bank and
so,
fintech are actually pretty different.
yeah. And so the required objects, like within a payment, they required Australian specific stuff that we never kept. We don't need, that's not who we are. They were trying to tell us that you need to support this. I'm like, no, we don't have your IBAN number. We don't have this, country. So we had to fight to go, and I designed it. I'm proud to say I can show you my modules that are part of the Australian regulation because we had to get some schemas that we could use that just described our customer. We didn't know their IBAN numbers. We never, and they said, well, you should collect that. Well, you're asking us to change our entire business model for you. No, we don't use this number. We don't want it. We're not going to do it.
Right.
So it was hilarious.
But to your point,
I
Brazil
will
was
tell
not as
you, and
cooperative. Brazil's like,
yeah,
here it is.
Brazil didn't
Just
care.
do it.
Don't care.
You
Yeah,
want your license or
it was,
not?
that was, yeah. Here's what we'll respond to. No, we'll
Yes,
suspend your license.
that's right.
Australia was so funny. I have to. You can edit this out if you want to, but it's pretty funny. We knew there were two parts to Australia. There was the government side, and then there was the data standards board that did all the technical stuff. I had irritated them with my findings that we can't meet our deadline because of these technical findings, and they were not happy because they wrote them. So we knew this meeting was going to be angry and combative. So with the regulators, it's not what you want to enter into. So okay, I had a fairly humorous background that I had for the Zoom call, and the guy that was about to attack me just started laughing right out of the box, and it set the tone to the meeting on such a different path because you could tell as the VP was like introducing everybody, they were just looking at me like,
Who is
yeah,
this
that's the
guy?
guy. Um, yeah, why is he saying we don't know? So yeah, it instantly set that humor paid off in spades because it did. It was like everybody just started laughing. It was the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy thumbs up logo.
That actually is a good one. I remember that. That was a good movie. So, in addition to regulators, what kind of things did you deal with internal to the company, like organizational challenges, all the different teams you had to have playing a part in this? Did you have any challenges around that?
We had a lot of challenges in this, and just like I had said, the battle we had with the regulators, if we don't do this for a living, right? There were certain pieces like the authentication authorization. For example, Australia set up a repository, which I loved them for this. And I tried to petition the US government to get this in our requirements for CFPB, was a repository of businesses that had been approved to play in open banking. And it was a repository like PCI that you had to go through fairly rigorous reviews. You had to attest to your stability, your data standards and security and your protocols and all of that stuff you had to attest to. And they had a test environment where they had to run it against your system to make sure you were there. Once that happened, you were approved. But where that came into play for us, is they required us to poll that every 5 minutes to see any updates, and on every call that came in to make sure those people were still valid and registered. And so our department who handled all the authorization authentication felt that they didn't have to do this dynamic polling or some of the requirements. And they were just like, well, we need to tell the government we're not doing that. I was like, well, yes, we are.
This is
We
the
have
fun
to.
thing. I like.
And
You got to
so
tell the
it
government,
was,
right?
yeah. And they just wanted to call the government up and say, we're not doing it. So it was some constant battles with that particular team was pretty intense because it's a set process, right? We're asking them to change their core business processes and core code. So they didn't want to do it. And so I had to force them to read the regulations, say, you have to do this. You have to understand this. I got the APIs and everything else, but you have to do this. Now we can debate on whether what they're saying is not the best way to do it. That's fine. You can't say we're not doing this. So there was a lot of those battles with like our customer service area. There were a couple of big domains within this company that didn't feel they had to do anything because that's not their business. Right.
Right.
So that was a lot of the hurdles that we had to
Yeah,
tackle.
that kind of goes back to the original question too of who ultimately gets to say thou shalt meet this requirement in the regulation or it doesn't apply to us. It starts with legal, right? Legal has to make an interpretation of
Yeah.
where's the license at risk, in this case the license or whatever the thing is that's at risk, or penalties will take. So legal initially has to make that determination of how does this apply or which pieces of this apply to us as our type of company. And then the implementation often varies between the regulators that are very specific and prescriptive, this thou shalt
Mhm.
do it this way, versus the ones that are more general, and then you have the flexibility to design around it, but you are in this place of no, this is what we have to meet as a requirement. There might be some design changes you could do in the execution of that, but most of the time, yeah, just calling the regulator is never going to work.
No, and what was funny in Brazil, okay, so Australia, the technical teams, I had to battle and help them discover, yes, we have to do it. In Brazil, it was the business side that were just constant conflicts and issues. One of the things that was, you'll get a big kick out of this, is I came to them and I said, okay, where are your business requirements? Well, we don't write, that's not our job to write business requirements. And I was like, what part of business requirements is foreign to you? And they refused to write business requirements. So again, luckily I had read all the requirements, so I started reviewing them again. I I came back to them and this included legal because they were petrified of the government. So that was another thing we had to overcome. Is like, you can like disagree with them, but what we found and I started questioning was the way that the legislation was structured was if you were this type of bank or this type of threshold, you had to comply with certain requirements, and one of those was sharing data, right? And if you were this type of bank and there was all kinds of verbiage and all kinds of criteria, then you had to share data, right? And I started to argue that we don't fall into those categories. So as we were starting to develop these APIs for the schemas, I kept saying, I don't think we have to share data. Now, where the other part of that said is if you acquire data, then you have to share data, right? And so there was a lot of confusing language, a lot of confusing interpretations, but I started to argue we don't have to share data, and therefore we don't need to develop the APIs. Finally got the lead VP in Brazil to hire in a consulting company that was very good at and very seasoned in Brazil in open banking. They came in on the second day of all these people that I've been, and they came back and said, you guys don't have to share data. And here's why.
Doug for
I,
the
I,
win.
I turned my camera off. So we were out of Brazil for the data sharing piece of
Yeah.
it. Yeah, it was that. Those were some of the issues because this was
Yeah.
new regulation,
But these are
not
very
done
high
before.
stakes
So there was a
decisions.
lot.
Yeah, there's very high
Yeah,
stakes decisions here because you have the company's future of working in a market basically at risk if you don't meet the requirements or don't meet them correctly. So
yeah.
sometimes you do have wiggle room. Sometimes you can negotiate with the regulator. And I've been part of those conversations as well. It's though knowing when you're interpreting the regulation correctly, you're not overbuilding and you're building what actually will work and get you through the regulatory reviews. It is actually a pretty sticky space when you really think about meeting regulatory requirements. They're high
Well,
stakes.
that's why I was telling you at the beginning was this was really a good one because it was so new and we were in uncharted waters. Uh, in PSD2, when I after we launched in Australia and found out we didn't, I immediately turned to PSD2 because as I was looking at the solution that I wasn't on this particular launch in PSD2 because it was first, but I came in and between myself and my VP, we decided we needed to build an open banking platform at this company because of all the reasons we had talked about, different legislations. We can build it configurable and reusable, scalable. That's what we need to do because there's no solution. It was all piecemeal. What I found out when I was talking to the one architect in PSD2, they were non-compliant. What they put out in a hurry and rushed it was non-compliant, and they confirmed that. Even worse, they were using core code. And I'm like, the one thing you don't want to do is get a regulatory compliance code in your core code because that opens up audit to anything and everything that that code
Increases your
touches
scope.
or
Yeah.
relies on.
Totally increases your
Yeah.
scope of an
And
audit.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, so we came back through after we launched in Australia and we redesigned the APIs and some of the processes to get it off the core code and make it compliant. So we were able to close. We actually got a finding in Europe because we were non-compliant, and I eliminated that with the APIs in the proper fashion because again, didn't really understand the requirements, and they thought, well, we'll just put this in, and then they made the
So
call that was satisfying the law. It was not.
says who? It's always the says who. Ultimately, it's the regulator or the auditor, right? So when you think
Yeah,
about the overall, we think about projects in scope, schedule, cost, quality, often those types of variables. What do you think was the hardest of those variables to manage in this project?
it was the fractured distribution of too many experts. Not. I wouldn't even say experts. Too many groups and individuals that had bits and pieces of each little piece of a regulation. There was nobody that had a holistic view. Nobody understood the entire regulation. So you were constantly trying to find, oh, well, somebody that's this department who looked at that piece of the legislation. And so, again, this is my obsession. I'm not a checkbox, project lead. That's why I wanted to get in and read and understand every single regulation because there was no current view of that because it was nobody's job, right? This is my job. I created this platform. I need to understand the regulations, and that was something that really, really helped
Total
because then
sense of
I could have a
ownership.
conversation. Yeah, and understanding the whole picture. So I could go back to the lawyers who put their requirements in legalese, which was just a kind of a cut and paste and re-legalizing some verbiage, didn't tell me what we needed to do. So I had to understand the legislation, read through what they said, and then interpret their legal interpretation to make sure I understood what they actually meant. That was one of the learns that I did was I can't rely on the business or legal to understand the entire legislation, but I'm the one whose neck to choke for delivering it. So as we do these, I kind of realize why did I keep jumping in front of like, well, Maui, 135 billion licenses for the company.
Big
What
license in one
mechanism
of our
don't I
biggest
have that
markets.
says danger?
Danger, Will Rogers.
I needed that. Will I needed that? I needed that in Lost in Space. Warning, warning, danger. But again, I just I love the challenge. It was so much fun because it is. You do battle and then you laugh at each other. There were a couple of good legal people in Europe that I would get on a call and they would go, "Oh God, Doug's here. Now what?" You know,
Not
and that
this
we would
again.
just be prepared, and we had so much fun. Just like, now what?
Yeah.
But what? What? I'm a lawyer. You're not.
Yeah, the lawyer. I don't
Again,
really enjoy
humor
these
always
technical
works.
conversations. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, here's Doug. I mean, well, yeah, because that's exactly what it was. Legal. We had in Europe some really good battles on what we're doing is not violent. Yes, it is, because we did. No, it's not. And we would always have these rounds. And I would pull up, and I even went through and organized in spreadsheets each of the pieces of the legislation because they were referenced in 8 other documents, and then amendments to those documents. So I just said, I can't do this. So I put in all the, so, and I would start citing those, and then, God, Doug's doing it again. Paste it in the screen. See, right there, that means this. Okay. And then
And
I'd lose some of those arguments, but I won some. But we got to the right spot. That's the fun part.
yeah, I would sum up again, high stakes initiative, big risk to the
Yeah,
company, and especially in some of the bigger markets. And if you think about all the things that you dealt with on the challenges on this project, and the complexity was extremely high. So we say high stakes, right? Complexity very, very high.
oh,
Deadlines existing, in some cases fast deadlines like in Brazil. The high stakes piece of risk, the risk and the impact was very, very high. So when we talk about what is a high stakes initiative, this meets all those boxes. And the piece around
yeah,
like how do you lead through this, the ability to work and navigate across an organization, the willingness to take total accountability when you're leading this kind of initiative. I'm going to be responsible at the end of the day to make sure this lands. So I better know every nook and cranny of what has to get delivered and what success looks like, and be able to translate that to many different types of people in the organization. So to get down to that
yeah.
level of detail and say to the legal team, here's how I read this and how we're going to implement it, make sure we can sign off, but do that in a way that's not overly technical. Talk to an engineer who is very technical and say, no, this is why the business requirement has to be met this way because this is what's in the
Yeah.
regulation. Go to the regulator and say,
Yeah,
yeah,
you
we don't
can't
really
allay
meet
this
that
in
kind
that
of
way.
right. We don't really meet this kind of a requirement.
I
You're missing something in your specification. That ability to translate
well, it
across
was
many different audiences is a really key
yeah,
leadership quality when you're talking about these
it's
high
a
stakes initiatives, being able to talk to every department in the company basically and externally.
yeah. And I found that one call I told you about with the DSB again intimidating. I'm fearless, but there's something. These guys design the system, so I can't walk in thinking I am. These guys are really, really smart and really good. But even the level out when you start, you're not coming in with just hyperbolic, oh, we can't do this because of that. You're going to do this kind of attitude. But when you start talking about objects within objects within objects within objects in this data field, and this is the required fields don't match. And I had that all documented. Like, they started to realize, okay, Doug has done his homework and he's coming at us with real concerns. That disarmed them quite a bit when I came in. Like, look, in these 3 modules over here, you've got it over here, because there were like 5 or 6 different disbursements of the same object and several other APIs. And what one guy came back to me and he said, Doug, I have to apologize. I missed those 2. He didn't realize that field was over here and a few other APIs. So
So
it was like I made a lot of
details
friends in there because they
details
were like,
matter.
okay, yeah,
Yeah, level of detail
yeah,
matters.
it was fun.
Very cool.
Yeah,
What would you say
it was tough, but
what would you say wrapping this up was your greatest, like in thinking through the leadership moment that was the epitome of this whole project? What was the leadership moment that you would wrap up this whole project with?
when we went live in Australia, it was brutal. we did a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on the project. We had to hire a third party company to test our system and beat it to death. That one domain, the authorization piece, had to become Frappy certified. So that was a total new ballgame. And to pull all that together and go through that testing and start to see the results and feel the camaraderie and the friendships now between those two big sparring partners in people was just a great moment. To They were now on the same, we had gotten on that same team when we started to see the problems that we needed to fix, and it became a one team, to tackle all this as we were nearing the deadline that we said we would meet. So that was probably one of the greatest moments right there. Once we did all that and that company beat our code up to death, we launched on time, got us out of a very bad situation in Australia. We were fighting with the regulators a lot on other things. And that got us in the good graces and got them off our back. That was a very satisfying thing. The executive VP of the company threw us a congratulatory
I was going to ask about celebration. What'd you
little
do to celebrate?
town hall.
Yeah.
That one we just fell over. My counterpart that they hired in Australia, still friends today. She said we all just collapsed. There was big celebrations. We didn't do any official things, but we had a big pat on the back thing. We all just collapsed because it was stressful. It was long. They were 17 hours ahead of us. Or
Right.
I think they were ahead of us. So
Yeah.
we were at all hours of the night, and it was just very satisfying. We all smiled, and everybody was appreciative of the effort because we were all exhausted.
Yeah. Well,
It was exhausting.
in the
Um,
stages of the team life cycle, celebration actually is a very important stage once you accomplish your goal. Getting people through
yeah,
the
we still
storming, norming,
we still
performing,
talk
right?
about it.
Yeah. And those are the kinds of
And the other
experiences.
one that translated into yeah, that immediately translated into fixing PSD2 and getting a finding closed. So those were the two back-to-back celebrations that we did. And I have to tell you on a personal note, the founder of that testing company was a Australian Dutch. We had so much fun and we beat each other up, fought all the time, and just had fun. And it was in a fun way. But he was brilliant and just a lot of fun. But he knew the law, and that was amazingly helpful. But yeah, everybody kept saying, we're looking at you talking to the Australian self and Stuart talking to his American self. It was pretty fun.
That's great. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me here today, Doug. I think there's a lot of great lessons learned in this one. A very high stakes initiative delivered successfully, so big wins at the end, with a lot of challenges in between start and finish that we've learned a lot from. So thanks for sharing that with us. And for those who joined us today, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'd love you to like, share, and subscribe and come back for more future episodes.